Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story. President Trump posting on Truth Social on Monday evening that a ceasefire has been agreed between Israel and Iran, while China, Iran's top oil buyer, still remains a key player, with Russia closely watching. An expert breaks down what to expect from China after the U.S. strikes on Iran.
What they're going to watch and see is just how serious the Americans are.
Clinical trials sending Americans' DNA to China and other hostile countries are now on hold. The FDA says some U.S. patients' cells are genetically engineered and returned without their consent. China may have built a stealth bomber similar to the U.S. B-2 Spirit using stolen secrets. About 20 years ago, a former engineer who helped build the B-2 admitted to leaking classified U.S. military technology. We begin with the situation in Iran. President Trump posting on Truth Social that a ceasefire has been agreed between Israel and Iran. The announcement comes hours after Iran launched multiple missiles at a U.S. airbase in Qatar. Tensions had escalated after the U.S. struck 3 major nuclear facilities in Iran on Saturday evening. In retaliation, the Iranian regime fired missiles Monday toward U.S. military bases in Qatar and Iraq. So far, no U.S. casualties have been reported. Beyond the military conflict, fears are rising worldwide over Iran's potential shutdown of the critical oil shipping route, the Strait of Hormuz. On Sunday, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio urged Beijing to pressure Iran not to take that step during a Fox Business interview.
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide.
About 20% of the world's oil shipments pass through the Strait of Hormuz. On Sunday, Iranian state TV said the regime must make the final decision on whether to close the strait, a move it has threatened before but never carried out. The U.S. Fifth Fleet is tasked with protecting commercial shipping in the area. So why is the U.S. now asking China to pressure Iran over the strait? If the strait closes, U.S. allies in Asia, including Japan, South Korea, would be hit hard since much of their oil passes through this route. China, which buys more Iranian oil than any other country, relies heavily on this supply. China buys nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports, and Iranian crude made up about 16% of China's seaborne oil imports. A closure of the strait could send global oil prices soaring and seriously damage the world economy. On Monday morning, President Trump posted on social media urging everyone to keep oil prices down. Brandon Weichert, author and senior national security editor at the National Interest, explains how a potential closure of the strait could impact both China and Russia.
Iran feeds a lot of oil and natural gas to China. So if what I'm saying is correct, and I believe it is based on my sources in Russia, and I have a lot in Russia, the Russians are telling the Iranians to cut off the energy supplies by going into the Strait of Hormuz. That's not only going to hurt the global market, that's specifically going to hurt China. So what I think Putin is doing is he's the master chess player here. He wants to see the gas and oil prices skyrocket to feed the Russian war machine. He wants to see the Americans unable to resupply and support Ukraine. And also he wants to put China in its place, right? By going after their oil supplies, he forces China to then rely more heavily on Russia, and he basically makes China the kind of the junior partner in the Russo-Chinese alliance, which until recently the perception, as you know, Tiffany, was China's the dominant partner and Russia's sort of the go-along guy.
Beijing and Moscow have issued statements against the U.S. military strikes on Iran, but according to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, there is no evidence so far that China is involved in the conflict. Still, it's worth noting China's long history of supporting Iran, dating back to the 1980s. China allegedly helped Iran's nuclear program by building research centers, supplying key materials, and training engineers. So how might China respond? Secretary of State Marco Rubio is urging Beijing to step in and stop Iran from shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, the U.S. has deployed 2 decoy B-2 bombers to Guam. Was that a quiet warning to China? Joining us now to discuss is retired Marine Colonel Grant Newsham, author of When China Attacks and senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. Grant Newsham, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Now, Iran carried out missile attacks on the U.S. airbase in Qatar, which U.S. officials said were intercepted and no personnel were killed or injured. Now, in terms of a broader response, though, many note that China is one of Iran's most important economic partners or helpers. But how much actual help could we be seeing from China to Iran?
Well, I think China's in a difficult spot right now. They buy about 90% of Iran's oil, all of it exported in violation of UN, or at least US and some UN sanctions. So that's about 20% of Iran's GDP. And China, sells some things to Iran's machinery, electrical goods, etc., and it imports some minerals as well from Iran. But in terms of being actually able to provide help, there's not much they can do. Militarily, this shows the limitations of Chinese power projection capabilities. And power projection means the ability to apply military force some distance from your border. There are a couple Chinese spy ships in the Persian Gulf, reportedly, and maybe one Chinese warship. And these are able to obtain a lot of intelligence, particularly useful for targeting for the Iranians.
We have seen some reports that China helped build one of the nuclear sites that the U.S. bombed in Iran. So there's that angle, too. But in terms of the oil aspect, right, there's a lot of attention on the Strait of Hormuz right now, as 20% of global oil goes through that. And most of, as you're mentioning, sanctioned Iranian oil goes to China, which would really hurt China. On that note, we did see Secretary of State Marco Rubio calling on China to stop Iran from closing that strait. How likely is China to do that? And is it easy to close that strait?
Well, it's actually harder to close than you might think. And we have some experience here in the early 80s when the Iranians and the Iraqis were fighting. And the Americans had to get together and lead an escort program to get ships up and down the Persian Gulf through the straits. And they were able to do it. So it's not as easy as you'd think to shut it. If Iran really does try, then the Americans and any allies that might be able to have a few ships and aircraft available, which is a very short list, they could probably take care of the problem pretty quickly. But it would take a lot of effort. It's not quite as simple as it sounds. One thing I did want to mention also is, you covered it, is that China has been a huge supporter of arms to Iran for at least a couple decades now. And Iran has parceled these supplies out to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis. They've got less of them to parcel out now than they did in the past, but that is part of the equation. And it's hard to imagine China sort of loading up tankers or freighters and aircraft with military supplies and hardware and sending it off to Iran. It could happen, but I think that's very unlikely. Would China actually put in a good word with Iran to not close off oil flows or traffic through the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz? They could. I think as likely they would say, look, please don't hit Chinese ships.
On that note of Taiwan, in terms of Operation Midnight Hammer, a bunch of decoys were sent out, and 2 B-2 bombers were actually sent to Guam as part of a misdirection. But was that also a message to China in terms of Taiwan?
I think it was. Maybe the biggest message was that America's got some will, that you've got somebody in the White House who's willing to pull the trigger and to fight. In the past, there has always been a sense the Americans can be goaded, they will always back off. They will never quite defend themselves or their friends. And that's been successive administrations until Trump #1. And now Trump #2 is showing that it is not going to back off. And that is something that forces the Chinese and the Russians to adjust their calculations. But sending the B-2s out to Guam, that was a very good misdirection play by the administration and achieved the impossible of actually keeping a secret in Washington, D.C. So they did a very good job on that.
Now, in terms of this Operation Midnight Hammer, will the success, if you will, of this make China rethink its Taiwan invasion plans?
I think it will. It just has to, almost by definition. But I don't think it will change their objectives. They're just as serious about taking Taiwan, illegally taking Taiwan, as they've ever been. They may have to sort of modify the way they go about it and their timings. But as I say, their basic objective has not changed. What they're going to watch and see is just how serious the Americans are. Do they have the staying power, the political, economic, military to handle multiple problems and to get involved in a fight over Taiwan. But it is going to, as I give them some pause.
Well, Grant Newsham, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Always appreciate it.
The Trump administration is halting new clinical trials that expose Americans' DNA data to hostile states like China. On Wednesday, the Food and Drug Administration announced an immediate review of the Biden-era program allowing this practice. Here's more. According to the FDA, clinical trials approved under the Biden administration are sending American citizens' living cells to China and other adversaries. These trials are now paused for a full-scale review. The agency fears hostile states could misuse the data to threaten U.S. public safety. Back in December, the Biden administration approved a sweeping exemption, allowing U.S. companies to send biological samples, including DNA, to firms tied to the Chinese Communist Party. The exemption took effect in April. Now, the FDA under the Trump administration says mounting evidence shows some trials used Americans' biological materials without their knowledge or consent. This lack of transparency poses a serious security risk. That's why the agency has halted the program. Now, companies must be fully transparent with the government, get ethical consent from participants, and handle all sensitive materials only on U.S. soil. Trials failing to meet these standards will not be allowed to continue. President Trump is calling for a special prosecutor to investigate allegations of fraud in the 2020 election. This comes days after the FBI declassified documents alleging that China conspired to execute a ballot fraud scheme in 2020. NTD correspondent Jason Blair reports.
President Trump says an investigation into the 2020 elections needs to be carried out. On Truth Social, he alleges election fraud took place in 2020 and writes, "The evidence is massive and overwhelming. A special prosecutor must be appointed. This cannot be allowed to happen again in the United States of America. Let the work begin." This post from the president comes almost a week after the FBI reported that in 2020, China allegedly conspired to carry out a fake election ballot scheme by mass producing fake driver's licenses. On June 16th, FBI Director Kash Patel said that he gave the newly declassified documents to Senator Chuck Grassley for review. Officials say these intelligence documents never underwent a full investigation. Journalist John Solomon told Real America's Voice that Patel and Grassley have a lot of sleuthing to do.
But for the first time, we do know the FBI had reason to think that China was trying to swing the election to Donald Trump, to Joe Biden and away from Donald Trump.
According to documents obtained by the Epoch Times back in 2020, the FBI alerted federal agencies about fake driver's licenses coming from China. However, the alert was later recalled and the FBI asked for the memo to be destroyed. And just weeks before this, authorities say that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection intercepted nearly 20,000 fake IDs, most of which were made in China. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
China might be working on a bomber that looks a lot like the U.S. B-2 Spirit, the same stealth aircraft used in strikes on Iran over the weekend. The U.S. deployed its B-2 Spirit to target Iran's most secure nuclear facility. Satellite images from May show what appears to be a large stealth aircraft at a secret test base near China's Xinjiang region. Based on its wingspan, about 170 feet, this aircraft is a close match to the U.S. B-2 stealth bomber. So how did China get its hands on something like this? In 2005, a former U.S. defense engineer named Newsham was arrested for selling military secrets to China. Gawadia worked for about 25 years at Northrop Grumman, the lead contractor for the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The FBI began investigating him in 2004 after finding classified military documents in his possession. Reports say Gawadia traveled to China multiple times in the early 2000s, handing over sensitive U.S. military technology to the Chinese regime. When the FBI raided his home in 2005, they reportedly discovered 500 pounds of evidence, including documents and electronic media. Gawadia admitted that he helped China develop a cruise missile and called his own actions espionage and treason. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Coming up, China reportedly targeting key chemicals used to make fentanyl, the deadly drug driving America's opioid crisis. This move follows talks with U.S. officials aiming to curb the drug flow. In America's backyard, cheap Chinese electric cars are flooding Brazil's market, threatening local automakers and jobs. And the EU is pushing back against China on trade, this time targeting medical contracts. Brussels aims to curb what it calls unfair competition in the healthcare sector. That and more in just a minute here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. China reportedly plans to put a closer watch on two chemicals used to make the addictive drug fentanyl. These chemicals have been added to a list for increased control. Here's more.
The increased supervision is set to begin July 20th. The announcement came after a meeting between U.S. Ambassador to China David Perdue and the Chinese Minister of Public Security. Despite trade talks that have lessened tariffs between the U.S. and China, a 20% tariff on China related to fentanyl has remained. The Trump administration has suggested the tariffs are a way of holding China accountable for fueling the opioid drug crisis in the U.S. The previous U.S. ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, has sparred with China on fentanyl. He has said there is going to be a price to pay if the regime doesn't help stop the fentanyl crisis. He has also described the Chinese regime as cynical and said he has personally how it lies and does not carry through on commitments.
Chinese electric cars are hitting Brazil's market at bargain prices. Local officials fear the influx could kill domestic jobs and stall homegrown production. Let's zoom in.
It's the world's biggest car carrier, containing the equivalent of 20 football fields full of vehicles. And it recently docked in Brazil for the first time, disgorging thousands of cars made by Chinese giant BYD. While that could mean budget autos for local buyers, not everyone is so happy about the new arrival. Brazil's own automakers say the flood of cheap cars threatens their viability. Igor Calve is president of the country's Association of Automotive Vehicle Manufacturers. He says the imports send a message that it's better to bring in foreign vehicles than make them in Brazil. BYD has developed a fleet of ships to boost its overseas ambitions. And right now, Brazil is its top target. The country's car market is the world's sixth largest by volume, and industry groups say Chinese firms are taking advantage of low import tariffs. They're urging the government to bring forward plans for higher levies to protect domestic makers. Other regions, including the EU and US, have moved much faster to impose steep duties. BYD and other Chinese firms are rushing to expand overseas amid tough competition and slim profits at home. In all, the country's vehicle exports to Brazil are forecast to soar almost 40% this year to around 200,000 units. BYD also has plans to make vehicles in the country, but that too has become controversial. Ministers initially cheered its purchase of a former Ford plant, saying it would help create jobs. But a subsequent investigation into labour abuses on the site has pushed back plans for full production to late next year. What happens next will be closely watched around the world, not least in Europe. There too, BYD is fast ramping up sales and says it plans to begin local production before the year is out.
The European Union is pushing back on trade with China, this time over medical devices. The bloc plans to block Chinese companies from bidding on major public health contracts, a market worth nearly $69 billion each year. The European Union announced it will bar Chinese firms from competing for government contracts exceeding $5.7 million for medical devices. The move is meant to push for fairer trade after the EU determined its medical device companies face unequal access to China's healthcare market. The EU medical device market was valued at over $170 billion in 2023. Most of that comes from public contracts. Only a small number of these contracts are worth more than $5.7 million. But those few big contracts make up almost 60% of the total contract value. An EU official says the new restrictions target high-value contracts for equipment such as imaging machines, prosthetics, and medical clothing. The Commission noted that China has long favored domestic suppliers, offering prices foreign companies cannot match, leading to unfair tender conditions. China is rolling out a new internet ID voluntary for now. For a country known for intense surveillance, Beijing says it will offer more safety for its citizens. NTD's Sean Marshall reports why some experts worry it could do the opposite.
In China, mandatory identity checks have already made it near impossible to stay anonymous on the internet. But the Chinese Communist Party has found a way to make it even harder for the Chinese people. The regime is rolling out a more centralized process to submit personal information on social media apps and websites by issuing a virtual ID that can be used to log in across different social media apps rather than separate checks for each platform. Experts are concerned about the new system eroding the already limited freedom of expression by giving more control to the state. On top of that, centralizing information can actually make big security breaches more damaging. Hao Chen-sun, a law professor at the University of Hong Kong, said a centralized nationwide platform inherently creates a single point of vulnerability, making it an attractive target for hackers or hostile foreign actors. Government data breaches have occurred around the world. One notable incident in China involved a police database containing the personal information of 1 billion citizens, which was leaked online in 2022. Sun also said that although the law presents the system as voluntary, it could gradually evolve into a system which users may struggle not to opt into. If the government wants to promote this Internet ID verification system, it can do so through various arrangements, essentially by encouraging people to adopt it, offering more conveniences in return. Sean Marshall, NTD News.
Taiwan might be able to boost its defense against Beijing. Nearly half of Taiwan's opposition lawmakers may soon face a recall vote, a move that could shift control of Congress to President Lai Ching-te's party. This could end a months-long political standoff and clear the way for Lai to strengthen Taiwan's defenses against China. On Friday, Taiwan's election officials approved petitions to recall 24 out of the 52 opposition lawmakers, with votes set for late July. If enough voters remove them, President Lai Ching-te could gain a legislative majority to push plans strengthening Taiwan's military defenses against China. Since Lai took office last year, the opposition Kuomintang Party, or KMT, has used its slim majority to block government spending, including on national defense. Some officials in the ruling party accuse the KMT party of helping China by weakening Taiwan from within. But KMT party denies these claims, arguing it wants to reduce tensions with China. That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.